So Mercury Rising is not a reference to a very bad American movie, which I don't recommend, but of course to the rising temperature and the climate crisis, and addressing this kind of impossible question related to the fact that because it relies on extracted materials, construction seems unsustainable literally by design. And also trying to address something that has been a rising concern, which is the fact that because of social pressure and also at times political pressure, the construction industries has actually deployed a quite agile way of addressing the harm caused by their industry through, let's say, greenwashing and the kind of simulated commitment instead of, let's say, actual change. And these kind of low integrity pledges that resonate, across the industry about net zero and this kind of claims and the difficulty to actually achieve those in reality. And we're very interested to explore how architects position their work beyond this kind of inadequacy, and try to understand also something that we've been actually personally confronted with, which is a kind of demands of purity when one tries to address these urgencies and the fact that there is an impossibility to untangle the position that one held. One lives in the world, so one is, amidst a culture of consumption and a culture of competition, and there is an impossibility to disentangle these things. And so also we're very interested to hear how architects have been addressing these complexities within their own practice. And so to help us articulate some of the answers that are addressed in this brief, we have invited 4 guests, and each of them are in dialogue with respondents and students from our studio. Today, Nathalie and Adam will be taking that role. So, but of course, our star tonight is Meriem Chabani, who will be talking about her work, and then we'll be discussing with our other star, Summer Islam. And we want to thank also Azar for designing this choreography tonight, and I hope that you also will enjoy it. So a few words about Meriem. I'm gonna make it short. The internet knows everything. She's an architect, an urban planner, and the founding partner of New South, which is a practice that prioritizes spaces for vulnerable bodies and territories in tensions. She applies the words of bell hooks, putting the margin at the center. And she has a stellar record of exhibition across the international architecture cultural map, and also teaches at Paris Malaquais Head and RCA in the UK currently. And she will tell us how she fights and how she fights sustainably. Welcome.
Hi. Well, first of all, thank you for honoring us with that much care in the preparation of this space for this talk. Also, thank you for being here. I'm very happy to see that many faces in EPFL. Actually, the last time I was here was 3 years ago, so it was before COVID, so it's quite nice to see that many faces in one place post-COVID. So this title is longer than the titles I usually go for, but it kind of tries to summarize 2 polar opposites that sort of structure, I'd say despite my better judgment and despite my better efforts, they are fundamental to how I and how we function. And I say we because I never work alone, although obviously I'm here on my own today. And this idea of piracy kind of stems from this need to sort of constantly escape the hole that we felt, or like the position that we felt we were relegated to as minoritized actors. And it all started in 2014. So I graduated from architecture school in 2013. And at the end of 2013, and in early 2014, there was this big exhibition at the Pavillon de l'Arsenal. And I don't know if you are familiar with this institution, but it is sort of the prestigious architecture institution in Paris. It is directly connected to the policies and the political actors of the city of Paris, because various elected officials actually are in the administrative board of this institution. And so everything that happens there sort of sets the tone for what is going on in Paris and in a sense more broadly in France. And so they had this exhibition which is called Immediate Futures, and it featured 36 diplomas from architecture schools. But they had one thing in common: they were all located around the Paris city area. So who wasn't invited at the time? I felt like my diploma was fantastic, and I knew of 5 other projects that were set in the Global South that I felt best embodied what the immediate future needed. So an approach that was sort of merging architecture and urban spatial practice with a necessary social, economic, and political understanding and analysis, and sort of merging everything to make projects emerge. And so we approached an art gallery located in Saint-Germain-des-Prés. So it's a neighborhood that mainly features art galleries that cater to a very rich audience, lots of African face masks being displayed there. It is a very specific public and a very specific type of art that is being displayed. So we thought, what better place for us to sort of try and break in than in here. And so we managed to convince an art gallery to organize this counter-exhibition, which was called New South, because why not? And it featured 6 projects that were set in 6 different cities in the Global South. They don't have a country in common, and really, to us, the Global South was not so much a location, or sort of beyond that point you are in the South, but rather a shared set of spatial, political, economic conditions, mainly a disfavorable position in a balance of power. And so it worked out because, well, first of all, it kind of started New South started as a research platform. So following the success of this exhibition, we sort of decided to start working together to push that agenda further. And we also got our first project proposal, which I'm actually not going to be talking about here, but it exists. And it's actually our first built project, which is a cultural center in Myanmar. And it's a really interesting project, but I'm sorry, I will mention it further. But anyway, what happened beyond that good news was actually something that also put a stop to our activities for a while, which was the 13th of November attacks in Paris, where we lost one of the members of our collective. And following that event, there was a long moment of assessment of what we were supposed to do, and especially what were we supposed to do with his work. And the work that Amin Ibn al-Mubarak left us was a beautiful project that was examining the relationship between the invisible and the visible in Mecca. So he he came from a Moroccan family, and he had done the pilgrimage to Mecca 3 times in his life, and he sort of took the time to try and represent an invisible landscape that sort of merged with the visible, extremely the infrastructural landscape, and basically the poetry of what he could see, and the lack of poetry of what was actually there. And so it was it was work that sort of triggered this desire to push it further and push it beyond simply displaying that project and again and again, and sort of triggered this current research into what the sacred and what the investigation into the sacred could bring to architecture and urban planning at large. And for that, well, I use this photo simply because, well, I think it's a beautiful photograph by Sebastião Salgado, and it kind of speaks to, well, what Charlotte talks about a lot, is that architecture comes with a price, and it necessarily comes with a form of extraction. And there is energy being spent, whether from the physical human bodies that are involved in its creation, or from the resources that are extracted or moved to make it happen. And so there was this idea of how do we try and engage with a value that is not simply money. Because try as we may, this is the value that governs the market and the societies in which we exist. We cannot pretend like they don't exist. So how do you fight a system of value if you are not able to construct and establish an equivalent system of value that can stand face to face with it? And here you have a photograph by Imani Jacqueline Brown of a sacred grove in Louisiana. And so Imani has been investigating the leftovers from the plantations and the traces that were left on the territory by enslaved populations that were extracted from the African continent. And this photo shows us what is no longer a plantation, but is still an agricultural land, so a productive landscape. And this grove in the middle is a burial ground. And it's a burial ground that stands the test of time and sort of shows us this contrast between two very contradictory systems of value. And we know this has value because it still exists. Oh, interesting. Well, the name is Mohammed Meriem. And this book sort of allowed us to go a bit further into our research. And so, Les Empires sous la Terre, Empires Underground, is an attempt to sort of look at the history of secularization and show the, let's say, the correspondence in time between the arrival of secularization and the arrival of colonization and sort of the start of extractive imperialism. And so I won't go too much in detail. I really encourage you to read it. If you can read French, it's now available in French, and it is currently being translated and should be available in English next year. But there was this idea that if the ground is dead, then what is there to prevent me from going deep and extracting whatever I need from it? And so the migrations that accompanied the colonial era that Mohammed describes were accompanied by also practices of the sacred traveling from one place to another. And here in this series of photos, we see the work of Meriem Chabani in England, where he sort of shows us the contrast between these inner spaces that were transformed, because these are mosques that were not originally mosques, but were transformed to sort of correspond to an idea of what that space should look like, and the urban context in which they're sitting. Similar work has been done by Mathilde Cassani in the USA, where we see the same logic of these non-sacred, profane spaces being transformed from within, from the very human practices linked to sacred worship. So sharing with you sort of this background allows me to move into how we try and move this into action, and how do we switch from this theoretical background and what we're trying to achieve into work that we're actually paid for and hopefully will find its way into reality. And for that, I'll take you to Paris and to this Google image of what comes up when you type mosque Paris. And so if we zoom in, well, first what we see is that there's not very many of them, but then also what qualifies as a mosque. And here, for example, this mosque is actually the ground floor of this building, with no apparent signs to discern whether this is a place of worship or not. Outside of Paris, well, there is one exception. What you see here to the left is the Grande Mosquée de Paris, so it's the Mosque of Paris, it's the visible Mosque of Paris, the building that serves that purpose, and it was built in between the two world wars as a gift to the Muslim indigenous fighters that fought alongside France during the First World War. So what we see here actually was borrowing elements from Tunisian and Moroccan architecture, sort of merged them into this neo-Mauresque interpretation of what a mosque looks like. But what message is clear is that it is a foreign architecture, a foreign form, for foreigners dwelling in France. And in the middle and the right, you have the Grande Mosquée de Saint-Ouen and the Grande Mosquée d'Argenteuil, where you have more contemporary interpretations of what that would look like, but we still see three elements that keep popping up. So sort of a minaret, a dome, and Arabo-Mauresque decorations on the facade that then again speak to an architecture from, let's say, North Africa, Middle East mainly, and sort of becomes this one image that, repeated again and again, gives us this almost ghost of an idea of what a mosque should look like. So this is Sabre, and I met Sabre in 2019, and he shares sort of the feelings that I had towards the architecture of mosques in France and more broadly in Europe. And so he's a young Muslim militant in Paris who started this association called the Muslim Think Tanks, where he gathered a bunch of young Muslims who were like trying to address issues regarding them and not letting other people speak for them, which in the political and mediatic climate where they were dwelling was nothing short of revolutionary. And so one thing that they were working on was the mosque that they wanted for the 21st century, the mosque that they wanted to pray in. And so he contacted me because in 2017, I had a friend of a friend who was working for Jeune Afrique and who was looking for someone, ideally a woman, ideally young, to sort of do a portrait of her. And it so happens that the person who did that portrait is also a young woman from the Paris suburbs. That's obviously the reason I got that press. But anyway, it was an opportunity for me to have some press at a moment where I had built nothing and really had for a track record like a couple of exhibitions. But I'm happy that I accepted despite feeling like it was a really bad idea, is that the reason why, sorry, I'm gonna read you what is supposed to be highlighted. The reason why Sab contacted me is that in here, I was saying that my dream project would be to build a mosque in France or Europe. And so Sabre reached out to me. And he told me, you know what, we're trying to do this. We met these people from the 11th arrondissement of Paris. They have a mosque, they want to transform it. They've been trying to work on it with a couple of architects, but it's just not working out. So how about you come and we try and move this thing forward? And we managed to convince them to trust us with designing this mosque. Keeping in mind that at that point, we'd done my mom's kitchen in Paris. But here we were faced with a really interesting situation because we had a community that existed. We understood the needs. They were like, it's simple. We can have 200 people praying right now. We need 1,500 people in here. As I'm not sure it's going to be possible, but at this stage, the only solution they had come up with was praying in the street. And obviously with the press you could expect from that, and the police intervening, now every Friday having police presence next to the mosque, making sure that no one is praying outside, and these barriers being installed right next to the building. So the message was clear. In the meantime, the people, like the organizers of the mosque, started organizing 2 prayers on Fridays. So if you're not familiar with Islam and its practice, you have a big prayer on Friday. It's kind of like the Sunday service at church. So instead of having one main service, they had to have 2 services, with the frustrations that can stem from that for the people who come for the second service, because in their mind that's not as good as the first one. Anyway, so it's an existing building that simply can't house 1,500 people. And here's a look at how this collaboration works. So there's us and mainly SBP Engineering, who are originally a German firm that has an antenna in Paris. And the reason I'm putting an emphasis on this is that actually we reached out to a number of engineering and various professionals to work with us on this project, and we received multiple rejections simply due to the fact that it was a mosque project. And then we have an assistant to the client, so assistant à la maîtrise d'ouvrage, who actually stems from the Muslim think tank. So Sabre, the guy that I showed you earlier, created this thing called a mosque, so play on words on the assistant à maîtrise d'ouvrage, specializing on how we can build mosques more proficiently. And the issue being that it's a building that operates as a public building, but can only rely on private funds, because the state does not fund that project. So how are we going to build something that, one, lasts? Where are we going to get that money? And secondly, can it even be a mosque? Because it can't operate only as a place of prayer. Right now, it's not operating only as a mosque. They have math classes, they have sports classes, They have a variety of activities that allow them to fund the cleaning and the maintaining of that building. So obviously we had to keep that in mind. So what we did was spend a year. So it ended up like in mid-2020. So initially we had these in-person meetings and we had to finish it online. But we had multiple meetings trying to understand and untangle what that building should, one, look like, and second, what should happen in it. And one thing that kept popping up was simply people expecting it to operate almost as a community center. And later on, we sort of addressed the big issue that remained for us as spatial practitioners, which was how do we actually give shape to these desires? And so we looked at the original forms and sort of the fundamentals of a mosque. And we could summarize them in 3 principles. One was that it is a space that is sacred in opposition to a delimitation of a space that is profane. Same as what this carpet kind of carpet is doing. Secondly is the direction. It's the direction towards Mecca. And third is the ability to pray with multiple people at the same time. And this photo is one of what they call nomadic mosques that pop up in the desert mainly. But in the context where we were at, we had a very constrained plot in Paris, a dense urban city. So we couldn't go and look for that surface horizontally. We had to look vertically for the growth of that building. And so before addressing the facade or any decorative elements, we spent a lot of time trying to address circulations and how we could get a building on multiple floor levels to operate as a sacred space, but also to allow for not individual but independent accesses, meaning that it could operate as a sacred space on one floor and as a library on a different floor and vice versa, or all at the same time. But anyway, giving us options in terms of that. And also playing with the fire safety regulations that were forcing us and sort of sizing these staircases and all the technical constraints we had to deal with. The second constraint was obviously kind of how do we go from walking on very dirty streets of Paris to being able to pray and being clean and ready to pray. And so the whole preparation for prayer in Islam goes with cleansing of the body, but also creating thresholds between clean and unclean was sort of structural in a building that has to house various uses at the same time. And so the sort of the choice that we made that wasn't necessarily an obvious, the client didn't agree initially, but we kind of managed to get there, was to sort of operate with 2 double height floors that kind of function together. So basically having these 2 main prayer rooms, yet having at the same time the capacity for every single available square meter in that building to become a prayer space. That means that even the spaces that are dedicated to the offices of the people working in the mosque can be transformed into a prayer space if the need occurs. And then we were headed into what really I wanted to leave for the last, because it really was the hardest part, which was, but really, what kind of face do we want to give to this mosque? What kind of architecture are we going to go for? And for that, we decided to turn to the sacred texts of the religion, but also the practice of it. And so one text that we decided to look at was the Nur, which describes God as a reflection of light upon light. And so there was this idea of light that we felt we could use because there was a strong architectural quality to it. And then there was this idea of something that moves constantly. So we have 5 prayers a day. We have 1 big prayer a week, and then multiple events throughout the year that sort of give a rhythm to this building and give a rhythm to its occupation. And so the sketch for the mosque was really that we wanted to have something that operated almost like something that can become a shadow and a reflection in the public space, but also something that can really shine light and become almost like a lighthouse. Because here we also wanted to address this idea of invisibilization of that practice in the urban setting that we were in. We looked at mobile forms of architecture, mainly curtains, as the main way to sort of design that building. So we decided to do away with walls and only opt for curtains that could easily be opened and closed and accompany the transformation of the uses throughout the day, but also kind of attempt a technical challenge by having metallic curtains outside. And so the building looks like this, or hopefully will look like this if we manage to build it. And it functions as something that can be entirely closed and sort of reflect the light from outside, depending on the time of the day, or reveal light from within. But it's also something that can be opened up. And so we have multiple layers of curtains inside, layers of curtains inside. And some of them, sorry, it's a little slow. Some of them are used to define the space. Okay, so here you have sort of an axonometric section of what would be going on if we are fully praying, or if we are having like classrooms and yoga classes. And so if we are praying, we want intimacy, so we would be closing up the various layers on the side of the street, but opening them against the walls because we want sound to travel. On the contrary, needing a bit more intimacy inside, but also defining spaces inside. We would be closing up and opening up these curtains inside, but opening the curtains outside. And so the struggle was real to get to the point where this space for the mosque was something that could also be accepted by both our clients and a community of aging first wave migrant workers from North Africa mainly, of what a mosque could look like for them, but also for the children and grandchildren that were demanding something that was a French mosque for French Muslim people. And when I keep saying I hope we will get to build it, is that we're faced with a political climate that is unfavorable. And so in 2021, yeah, I'm kind of lost in time, but yeah, at the end of 2021, we have this law they came out against, do you remember the name? La loi séparatisme. La loi séparatisme. This idea, separatism, actually really being a broad idea that mainly targeted Muslim associations that started being closed down by the state. Our clients were actually received the first visits by the police before that became actually, that spread to other mosques in France. And so we could really feel sort of the pushback that was awaiting us. And there were protests, and what Sabre decided to do was try and create a community, a stronger community around this project. And so he organized these talks called the M Talks. So it's basically a TED Talk, but for Muslims. And I had the pleasure of speaking there. It was in the biggest auditorium in Paris. And I'm not bragging, but it's the only auditorium that allowed us to get there. It was obviously the most expensive one and the biggest one, but there was a real question of also where we were allowed to speak in public. And so Sabre has been progressively gathering a community of people around this project, but more broadly trying to create solidarities for and with young and less young French Muslim people. So as I'm telling you this story right now, we're finally able to start again on this project. We just came out of a presidential election year and then a legislative elections where we couldn't do anything because the mayor of Paris was running for president. So we're not going to submit a permit for a mosque in the midst of a presidential race. Anyway, maybe this year. And then maybe at the other end of the spectrum, here's what started happening in parallel. So New South, as I mentioned, started as a research platform. And we started getting, quite quickly actually, opportunities to have exhibitions here and there, to speak and do some talks. But one thing remained almost impossible. It was to break into construction. And we felt that constantly we were being pushed away from anything that had to do with serious architecture. And when I say serious, it means who was being displayed at the Pavillon de l'Arsenal, who got the space, who was allowed to speak up, but also who was thinking and designing the projects that keep being built in Paris and in France. And it was not people who looked like me. And in 2021, I saw an article news pop up about the fact that Tati, are you guys familiar with Tati?
Yes.
Yes? Who's not familiar with it?
It's a shop, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. It's a shop, but it's more than a shop. It's an institution. Basically, Tati was this extremely popular shop, mainly for migrant populations or poor people in general, because before we had IKEA, before you had all of these cheap low-cost options, people would just go shop at Tati. But things changed, and Tati sort of went out of business precisely because of IKEA and the likes. And it so happens that I live right in front of Tati in Barbès, and I felt, you know what? They're gonna do it. I have to be the architect. I have to get in there. And we had no contacts with the people who were going to be running for it, because to give you context, also this happened within the Reinventer Paris competition. And Reinventer Paris is this sort of competition that is set up by the city, but has real estate developers competing against one another with an innovative project. And so for once, developers are picking architects and trying to like have this team that can help them win this competition. And in theory, we thought it's perfect. It's not going to be decided solely on who buys it at the biggest price. It's going to be decided by who has the best project. And so I contacted a few real estate developers who said no. And then I reached out to a couple of friends, and I found out that an Algerian friend of mine had started working for a real estate developer, which is called Nexity, which is the biggest developer in France. And I was like, you need to get me a meeting with your boss, because I'm the architect they need. They don't realize it yet, but they can't do it without me. And at the same time, I had a friend who was working in politics and had this massive network of people, and I asked him, do you by any chance know someone who has anything to do with Tati? And he told me, yeah, I know the old CEO of Tati. I can get you a meeting. And so I get that meeting with the old CEO, and he tells me, actually, I'm not the person you need. You need the owner, the current owner of Tati, who's the CEO of a different company, which is Jiffy, which bought Tati. And I was like, it's a never-ending struggle. But I was like, get me a meeting with him. And at the same time, I was telling my friend who's working for Nexity, you know what, I know the guy, I know the owner, and I can get you a meeting with him. And it worked. It worked, and Nexity accepted to talk to me, and I managed to convince them that they absolutely needed to do the project with us. And they were like, okay, but you're a bit young, so we're gonna couple you with like an older, more stable architecture practice. I was like, it's fine, we'll do it. And so we finally managed to get our foot in the door, but at the same time was getting ghosted by the owner, who was not responding to our texts, or even from the, he wasn't even responding to the text of the previous CEO of Tati, so it was like high-end ghosting going on. But I was like, you know what, it's fine, we're gonna work on it and pretend like, let's just see how far we can take this. And so we started working on the project, and the first meeting we got, well, it's 2021, so we still had a lot of meetings online, and so we had this Zoom call, and we had like 15 screens, and on the 15 screens, I could see a white guy popping up. And they were like, we need to do a project that's for the diversity of this neighborhood. I was like, right, okay. And the thing is, they hadn't finished putting the team together for the project. And so slowly, I started making friends with the guy who was managing the project on the side of Nexity. He was a great guy. And I was like, you know what? Tati is sort of based on this guy, Jules Waki. He was Tunisian, he came to France, he sort of started this whole thing of opening up stores to the street. Before, people had to ring before they could enter and buy stuff at the store. Like, that's the story we need to tap into. And you need to stop with your, let's make ecological, biologic, bio food court. Like, that's not gonna work. And I, in parallel, went to meet with a couple of people in the neighborhood. And I felt, shit, you should have done that before, but I was on the deadline, and I started like just texting absolutely and emailing absolutely everyone in the neighborhood, trying to see who would respond and how we could do something that would involve them in the project. And I reached out to this guy, Youssouf Ofana, who is the owner and founder of Maison Château Rouge, which is a small yet up-and-coming brand that originated from Château Rouge, so the 18th arrondissement neighborhood. And he himself kind of embodied this whole thing of, he started Maison Château Rouge because he had an association that was trying to bring money to the African continent. And so he started selling t-shirts, and it took off, and now he has this very successful brand. And so I was like, this is the guy you need, this is the brand you need, and this is who should be driving the program of your project. And then I reached out to a couple of other people, Alia Farid, who's Puerto Rican, and Saudi artist, Meet My Mama, who is basically, it's like, how do you say traiteur in English? It's like a caterer. So it's like a caterer business that like takes women who have never worked, mainly immigrant women, and teaches them, like they already know how to cook, but teaches them how to kind of do that professionally. And Mama Yoka, who's like a local restaurant in the 18th arrondissement, sort of trying to, every time they were pushing someone to be in the team, I was like, you know what, I already know the perfect people, here they are. And because it's easier to go with someone whose number you already have, and whose email address you already have, and who already has agreed, basically they would just say yes, because it was saving them some time. And so slowly I realized that the email list and also the Zoom meetings were starting to look more like what we were hoping to push for the project. So I'm not talking a lot about architecture here, because initially we didn't think about architecture much. We had this other architecture practice that was like studying the existing building and seeing how we could work with that. And we were like, okay, we're getting eaten up because they're more experienced and bigger than us. So for us to have a voice, we need to bring in something more so they can let us do architecture. And so we worked from the ground up, literally. So we started with the program of what would inhabit that place, what would inhabit the ground floor, and sort of worked our way into saying, but you know, it should look like this, spatially. And sort of then taking the project further and making a proposal for the transformation of this existing building. Do you know what happened? We lost. And we lost to Immobel. And we lost to Immobel, who's a Belgian real estate developer that bought the land for 10 million more. And they are now bankrupt in France, and so this is the last project that they're doing. But they had this beautiful Barthes Art Connection project that went out. So I'm a bit, am I salty? A little bit. So it was a blow. It was a blow because there was this beautiful dynamic that sort of built up during the whole thing. And we finally reached a point where initially no one was listening to me, and by the end I had this sort of like high-ranking guys in their costumes saying, Meriem, we were thinking of this, what do you think? Is that okay? And I was like, no. And they would actually listen. And this was sort of this trying to change this balance of power. That's what we were fighting for. And in the end, it kind of like came down. But there's some good news. So the aftermath is that Maison Charlotte Rouge still managed to get into the conversation. And they are now occupying temporarily, but hopefully in a more permanent basis, the ground floor of Tati. Like just a little corner. And it's working out really well. They're having like great events and exhibitions. But we don't know yet if they're going to be able to stay, simply because they went bankrupt and they bought it for too much money, so they need someone who pays a lot of money per square meter to stay here. So it's like an engineered disaster coming up. And then for us, we actually got paid to do that work. And then afterwards, we were requested by Nexity to work with them on other projects, which we were a bit surprised about, but we're like, great, we can start being part of that roster of architects that they're calling into to think and design tomorrow's city. And right now, Paris La Défense, which is this beautiful neighborhood of Paris, has started this competition that's trying to reinvent itself and trying to reinvent what this neighborhood could be tomorrow. More sustainable, more green, of course. And we're finalists right now in that competition together with Next City, which I don't think we could have hoped to achieve 2 years ago. We also won a different competition with Meet My Mama, so the girls who were doing formations for women and immigrant women, we won a smaller rehabilitation project in the neighborhoods, in the northern suburb of Paris, which is called Goutte de Lait, and we're quite excited to start working on this. And maybe also to not leave you guys with a bitter taste in your mouth, we managed to snake our way into the Pavillon de l'Arsenal in multiple ways. So they have this competition called FAIR every year, which is innovation competition, and so you just submit an idea and hope for the best. And so we submitted it the first time, but we were catering to like working class neighborhoods, so we didn't win. And then the next time I was like, okay, what would be the best way to make sure we get in? And so I just looked at the policies of the city of Paris and the things that they were trying to push, and I have to admit, without really caring about it much, we sort of crafted this proposal for the place of children in the city, and of course we won. Doesn't mean I don't care about children, but it just means that the way we reached that point, it was completely calculated, and it worked out. And that kind of helped us craft the position that Charlotte described initially, which now we had to sell New South in France and in the global North. Like, what does the South has to teach the North, whatever? Sorry, I'm running out of English. But, and the answer was, okay, we can't approach it this way. So we're going to tell them that what we're interested in is vulnerability, which is what we're interested in. But that's something that is more easy to understand and more universal in a sense than our position where we're like, actually, we kind of want to decolonize architecture and bring in like perspectives from the global South. So that wasn't bringing us any business. So I'm not sure how to conclude this talk because we're a bit all over the place and there's a lot of things that obviously I don't have the time to share with you guys. But I'd say that in the end, the work we do is constantly trying to create opportunities and push and sort of try and get as much as we can out of it. For example, winning the Children in the City thing that we didn't really care about. Now we're working with kids that we actually care about in the northern suburbs of Paris, from the neighborhood of Clichy-Montfermeil that was the most affected in 2005. If you are familiar with this history, we had 2 teenagers that were killed running away from the police. And there was a whole thing around police violence in these neighborhoods. And so today, the kids that we're working with and the opportunity to work with them stems from the financing and sort of the topic that we created with the Pavillon de l'Arsenal. So in the end, I am very grateful for it. And I just wanted to end on the most because I want to keep myself motivated, to keep pushing to exist. And now I'm going to sit down and welcome your questions if you're ready. Thank you.
Thanks, Meriem, for this fantastic talk and letting us into your work and so generously explaining how you've been slipping in the cracks. And the respondents for this talk are here with us. So we have Summer Islam, who is, and I didn't introduce her yet, I'm going to do that very shortly, a founding member of Material Cultures, a fantastic practice based in the UK, which is dealing with materials and how we can actually revolutionize construction. And we also have Adam and Natalie, who are our very own studio students who will join the conversation. So I'm really just here to facilitate and perhaps articulate a few questions in relation to our topic of beyond greenwashing, and also how to position ourselves as architects. And maybe I would just like to go back to something that was in your title and which you absolutely didn't talk about frontally yet. I'm sure you did that in more convoluted ways, which is the topic of piracy. And we had the chance to read, thanks to you as a recommendation, the work of Fatima Wasak, which discussed the role of climate racism, basically, and the absence of possibilities within the current discourse for a dialogue which incorporates race and ecology, and how these things seem to be somehow distant from one another. And more general, the question of emancipated forms of practice, which is something that I would also like to ask to Summer in relation to your own work, somehow as a kind of echo where perhaps we could discuss that more generally. So how some of the ethics of piracy allow you to operate as a emancipated practice. You mentioned a few times this kind of intentional, almost tactical way of dealing with the hurdles that you face, or that you face as a structure, but also as you face yourself. So perhaps you can tell us a bit more about this piracy question, and then I will immediately ask Summer to echo that, and then perhaps Adam and Natalie can also then ping back to you with the way they see that, or the way they perceive your work in relation to the ongoing conversation, also as learning or unlearning bodies in the school. So yes, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for allowing me to maybe articulate it a little bit more clearly. Obviously, there's one thing to address is what do I define as piracy to begin with. And that, to me, there's two things. We're not stealing, we're taking back what is rightfully ours. Second, it's also about the value that we place in truth. I have come to the conclusion that I find justice more important than truth. So I will not hesitate to lie if it serves justice. And it's saving me a lot of headaches. And third, to me, the piracy is also about merging things together. So we're constantly navigating two sides, which is on our militant activities, because that's something I don't really go too much into, which is more around theoretical practice and sort of the political militant activities that we're involved in. And at the same time, we want to, and that's a choice that we made, we want to exist as a fully functional, financially stable architectural practice, which is already a lot to ask for an architectural practice in France, but that's our goal. And doing that, we're constantly sort of moving from one side to another, and taking and grabbing things. So obviously, they are cross-contaminated. So now, when I'm in, theoretical and critical environments with my friends and my colleagues, I find myself bringing in things that I hated from the dirtier side of my work. And at the same time, obviously, our practice directly feeds from and upon the theoretical work that we produce. And so I feel like we had two choices, which was either to accept what was initially the job that was destined for us, which I could have kept teaching and living from teaching, and which I don't do actually right now, but sort of focusing our work, time and energy into crafting, curating exhibitions that look like the work that we want to see happen. Write, but the problem is I hate writing, and people are asking me to write a bit too much to my liking. I can produce 10 pages a year maximum, but they will be very high quality pages. But I will cry doing it, and so I knew I couldn't do a PhD, and I couldn't sort of take that work. So I felt like the best position for us was to try and accept this dirty and compromised role in between. And now we fully embrace it, and I get into arguments with my friends on both sides all the time. And actually, one of my clients within the Next City Nebula was like, but isn't she a bit radical? And I was like, oh, I thought I was hiding. But the thing is, like, I know that it's kind of catching up to us as well, and I don't know how long we're going to manage to pretend and to, like, this balance is quite delicate. But so far, like, also we're trying to lie to different people, and so like when they catch up with the lie, we sort of moved on to different clients who thinks they can trust us because these other clients trusted us beforehand. And really, I feel like we're making up all the excuses possible to just get the chance to build and have the chance to engage. And one thing that I don't even talk about is the actual constructive systems and the materials that we use for any of the projects that I talked about. Maybe I'll mention it there.
Over to me. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your talk. It was so interesting, and personally I found it incredibly fulfilling and nourishing to listen to 45 minutes, mostly discussion around mosques and their place in European cities, because I've never watched an architectural talk about them at all before. So thank you, that was really great. But on the subject of piracy, I guess I'm trying to interpret the way that your practice adopts maybe pirate behaviour, and maybe the way that I'm interpreting some of the things you were saying about your work. And I guess what I'm reading in it is that you're subverting a lot of the existing kind of cultures and practices in the industry to kind of achieve aims that you think have value for communities that you think need maybe defending or giving space within the city. And I actually have a question, so we can have a chat first. What are the dirty sides of your work? Because I think that's really interesting. And there are lots of dirty sides to what we do in our practice as well. And I think how you navigate the filth is the most interesting thing, actually, in the context of, I guess, the construction industry that we acknowledge is really problematic, but we are interested still in trying to engage with it. So, yeah.
Well, I think that building in itself is dirty, and I think that regardless of the materials or the systems that we choose, there's a sacrifice and there's a cost. And at the same time, I know that there are things, there's that, then again, balance of value and cost. Where are we getting out of it? And what are we losing in the process? And if I take the mosque, for example, so it has a modern structure. So it has like a poteau-poutre, so beam, whatever, you get it. Un système poteau-poutre avec un plancher bois. But at the same time, it has a lot of glass, and this is a south-facing facade. So it's going to be a fucking nightmare. But at the same time, what we're trying to achieve with it, and
basically the whole political and social challenge that we're trying to address, to me, requires for this transparency, and we can't find a cleaner way to achieve it. And then another aspect of it is innovation. And so for a very long time, sacred architecture has been a field of innovation in architecture. So churches, cathedrals, and mosques were always the place where you tested new construction techniques and you tried to take it as far as possible. And so here we were like, okay, we need to find an innovation that we can do and that we can actually do. And so that's why we opted for these this mobile facade. And we decided to work with SBP, and they're the guys who did the Christo and Jean-Claude packaging around the Arc de Triomphe. They did that. They engineered it, but they also are they specialize in the covers, the moving covers for stadiums, and so they have a lot of experience with these very complex techniques. And so we were like, okay, let's go for it. But at the same time, we know that if you have something that moves, it's going to break. It's going to have technical issues. So you need to plan ahead for maintenance. And then again, what are we getting out of it? And so it's, I think, all of these compromises that we have to come to, I guess.
Yeah, but I think that's really interesting, and it's important to acknowledge, and for other architects and also members of the public to understand where the compromises are, and that in this project, because it's going to be an iconic, city-wide first, that there are other priorities that sit atop in this instance of maybe a material shuffling through the building. And I think you find that in all projects, whether it's acknowledged or unacknowledged, in our work, there is no building that we ever will build which is pure, and there is no project which has that kind of, there is no such thing, I don't believe in it, but a kind of a tracing line through the project history and the client body, which means that every decision which was made has a kind of cleanliness about it. I really enjoyed the project. It's very beautiful, so I hope you get to build it.
Counting on you guys.
For funding.
Not just for the funding. I think it's also about. I think that there's going to be a moment where we need to know there's a push, and that's also why we're talking and raising awareness around this project and the fact that it needs to happen. So overall, it's what Sabre is doing, trying to build communities.
Thank you so much for the lecture. It's great to listen to, as you said, discussions about mosques in here. So I have comments and questions. The first thing is I really appreciate you talking about sacred spaces, and I feel like right now there's a shift in what is a sacred space, I love looking at a mosque that looks like this because I think of other examples. So I'm from Lebanon, and in Lebanon there's mosque and churches and just place of religion have always been a first tool for colonialism, and also they are the buildings that persist through time. So you have Ottoman mosques that got turned into churches by the French and then got turned back to mosque and again. And right now there's a shift in that. There's architects that are designing new types of mosques that are very minimal and different looking. So it's nice to see that you have to do that also in France to be able to do it. And then also recently after the explosion, the first thing that people built, since it was the community who did it, wasn't the religious buildings. It was their sacred spaces, so the houses, the streets, so it's interesting to see that. And I was wondering I know you also built things in the Global South, And I was wondering if you had to build a mosque in North Africa, would you do it differently? How would you do it? Would you go back to these symbols and things we always see in mosque? And then also this idea of like building that is dirty. Is when you build in the south, is it how different is it the things you have to deal with? I guess since it's the policies are very different, the restrictions are very different. You have your place there, but what's the other dirty side of it? Yeah.
So 2 questions. The first one, how would we build a mosque in North Africa? To be honest, I'm very happy that we didn't have to think about that first. Because I'm afraid that if we were to build, or at least if the first thing that we had to do was build a mosque in North Africa, we would have done what you guys saw, a sort of reinterpretation, contemporary interpretation of what was already there. So today, after this work, I think I would approach it the same way as we did the one in France. I would try and first understand what the need is, and try and get that shape out of the demands for what is to inhabit that mosque. And who is going to inhabit that mosque? Because I know that I'm Algerian, and we still have an overwhelmingly male population that attends the mosques in Algiers. To me, the question would be, what kind of mosque would I build for women in Algeria? That would be my next dream project. And then regarding the challenges in the global south, to be honest, it takes longer. Like, that's the main challenge. Everything takes a little bit longer. But the issues that we see in the global south are increasingly prevalent in the global north as well, at least where we work. For example, the public sector being increasingly weakened, and so public funding disappearing from the realm of projects that so far should have been led by the public. And so, for example, the building we did in Myanmar, it's a cultural center, but it also has to operate as a commercial center. So the ground floor is connected to the market. For the same reasons as here, because it's private clients and they're paying for a public building. And so how is it going to be sustainable in time? So I feel like it was a great teaching opportunity, a learning opportunity for us, is that we got into that habit of working on the program first. And then again, that's another trap, is that we're right now pushing against this sort of tendency of client to try and get us to just do the programming and then get a guy to design the building for us. So it's about trying to then again, open the cracks wide and kick them aside. So I think that mainly what we see is both from a political and economic standpoint, actually weakened states in the global north, and also from a climatic standpoint, what's interesting is that because the north is warming, we're also seeing an opportunity to recenter practices and constructive knowledge from the south. And right now, France is discovering Adobe and earth construction and architecture. But at the same time, it's kind of being, some inspirations are being erased. And it's then again, we're taking this inspiration from Iranian wind traps, but not crediting, the populations that came up with it. But anyway, so to us, there's potentially an opportunity here also in terms of construction.
Yeah, thanks again for the lecture. It was actually very interesting to see you actually mention to all of us what happens behind closed doors, lifting the curtain a little bit, opening the cracks, as you say, because it's very rare to see women of color practicing in architecture so actively. So seeing that was very exciting. We had the pleasure of reading one of your highly polished pages, speaking about the sacred. So I had a very close, attentive attention to what you took as sacred. My question has to do with very much that programming that you propose here, which is almost like a programmatic breathing, where it's in and out a mosque, and so it becomes in and out a sacred space. So it's not a space is necessarily always sacred. So that was very particular to me. So I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that. What should we learn about current sacred spaces as we know them? How do we interact with them as architects proposing new buildings, and can we actually propose things that breathe into the sacred but then retract so that they can actually pay for maintenance for the sacred space?
Very good question. Well, I think that mainly sacred is a matter of intent. And I feel like the example of the nomadic mosque best describes it. The states that the bodies go through are what define what is sacred or not. So one of the constraints, for example, if you go to this mosque to go to the library, is obviously you have to take your shoes off. So every single space that is being used for prayer is a prayer space that is a polyvalent prayer space. It's not a polyvalent space that also welcomes prayer. So the conditions that allow for prayer are sort of the ones that draw and design that space and how you should engage with it. So that just also maybe to clarify how you make these two cohabit. And at the same time, I think it's deeply connected to Islam as a religion and how it's being practiced. This idea that individually you can pray if you lay down a carpet, and for a moment in time, that space is sacralized. And so there's something in the beauty of that fluidity that we wanted to engage with and try as best as we can to translate into something quite static, which is architecture. Or hopefully not too static. But like, so I think that was the constraint. And then you had another question, but I forgot the last part.
Well, it was mostly what can we learn, and actually, do you think it's almost unnecessary to kind of do that act of piracy, lie and cheat and do whatever to get your foot in the door as someone that operates into a context that is mostly male, mostly white, and almost, I mean, to be part of that conversation and to introduce the real diversity, as you were saying, like the people that were listening to you ended up being the people that were saying we need diversity, but they had no diversity. So to get to a point where you can actually have a conversation with the users of the architecture and have an architect that represents those needs, do we need, as of 2023, hopefully in the future it's different, but lie and cheat and try to get your foot into the door?
What do you think?
Yes.
Hell yeah. No, but like the thing is, we need to kill this idea of fairness. You are all very aware that we are not on an even playfield. So what does it mean to play fair on an uneven playfield? I'm not playing that game. Like, I don't have time. You don't have time. We're running out of time. So it's about, I think, also engaging with tools that people are using against us every day. Like, this very notion, like, I'm sorry, because I know that every time, sometimes my mom listens to my talks. This is in English, so she's not going to understand. But she's like, no, truth is important, and you shouldn't lie. And she's a very good mom, and she taught me well. But the thing is, I think that I and the people I work with, we're all faced with the same realizations that you've already come to, which was that we're not on the winning side. And the people who are winning don't look like us. And so understanding that playfield that is in front of us, how do we navigate it, and how do we make sure that we can at least open up a corner? And that's something that I didn't really mention, but that we try and do actively. And I say try because sometimes, despite your best tries, whatever, it just doesn't work, which is that you need to remember that if you get in, you need to keep the door open behind you. Like, we need to kill this idea of there can only be one like me. I'm like, there's only men, I'm the woman, so when a woman comes in, like, you start getting scared and trying to cut them down. Like, that's also something that I think hopefully we're moving past, but that was quite strong in previous generations. And some of the worst abuse I have endured was at the hand of older women who had to fight really hard to gain their position of power. And so I don't blame them, but for sure I don't want to be repeating that dynamic. And if I'm ever in that position, hopefully I won't. And if I do, please come for me. But so that means also making sure that if you have a job opportunity, you know who you need to call first. If you see around you like an opportunity for someone, you know who you need to be pushing. And that's an active, it's tiring because it's never the easy choice. Because you know what? Generally, it's like the people who don't get the opportunities, they don't have as strong a CV as the person who got more opportunities at a younger age. And so you need to actually push for it quite strongly for it to happen. And I'm here today because some people took a chance on me very early on, and one of them was Léopold Lambert, he's the founder of The Funambulist, this great magazine that I really encourage you to read, that talks about power, space, and bodies. And he, I think a couple of months after our very first exhibition, had this big event in Berlin, which was called Public Space Fights and Fiction. Anyway, he was getting paid to create a magazine or a publication around the event. And he was like, do you want to do it with me? Do it with New South and the Funambulists? I'm like, I've never done this. It's going to be fine, going to be great. And the only time he saw me was me introducing him for his conference, the talk he did within our exhibition. He had no idea if I could write. He had no idea if I was not an idiot, but he still took a chance. And I don't owe him my whole career, but it was this early act of faith and trust that I'm trying to reproduce now, that sometimes I get opportunities to be like, who do you recommend for this? I know who I recommend for this.
Well, thanks for sharing all this really important experience. Also, I think it's really good to understand also things about sustainability that can also be perceived as a luxury at times. And, I think you gave a few examples that were really helpful to understand how complex these questions are.
Thank you for this very interesting lecture. I have two questions. The first one is, I found it very interesting, your analysis about how a mosque should look like in a European context, and I understand that you try to avoid sticking to iconic forms like a dome or minaret. But I was when I look at this building, if I don't know that it's a mosque, I would not guess that it is. It could be like an office building. It could be I don't know. Library, a luxury shop, And I was wondering if that wasn't important for you at all. That people that see it like in this context, in this neighborhood in Paris, know that it's a mosque, or it wasn't important at all for you?
No, I'd say that I questioned the idea that a minaret and a dome constitute a mosque. And if we take the time to look at, for example, Malian mosques, or even some Iranian mosques, they don't have a minaret. They don't. It's different construction cultures, and it's different architectures. And we sort of have kept in mind the Ottoman, like the Ottomans are our blueprint for what a mosque is. But the Ottomans, they arrived quite late. You know what the very first mosque ever built looked like? It was an enclosure, a dirt enclosure with the palm trees, trunks of the palm trees. That was like kind of defining. It was like a rectangle, and an inside and an outside, and then you had little stairs to come up and call for prayer. That then later on became the minaret. And so it's also about questioning sort of our idea of what constitutes that place. And so the idea here was to have it very visible, yet very hidden. And so having this thing where if you turn on all the lights, it becomes like this lighthouse in the street. And right now we have a mosque that already exists, and that looks like an old factory, because it's an old factory that has been turned into a mosque. So keeping in line with this, we wanted to, we made that choice. And it kind of goes back to that question about the North African mosque. I don't think, I wouldn't design that mosque anywhere else. I'm not even sure elsewhere in Paris it would look like this. But specifically there, specifically in front of the Maison des Métallots as well. The Maison des Métallots is the cultural center that is dedicated to people who work metal, which actually gave us the metal mesh idea. It felt like it was a good fit specifically there.
My other question was, you said that you also have a research project, and I was wondering, how do you link your projects, your build projects and your research projects? Is there a link or not?
Yeah, I mean, for example, we try and we have these des tiroirs. And in this tiroir, we have a research project, and we have multiple tiroirs. And so one is sacred ground, so this whole investigation where we're trying to link architecture, space, and the sacred. And it expresses itself in various ways. It can be research on mosque architecture, which we've done here. We're trying to finish an article for eFlux on the hidden mosques of Bordeaux, because it's not a problem just in Paris, it's a problem everywhere. And trying to investigate sort of the relationship between built space and sacred practices. And we have this ongoing project that started in Brussels, which is like a dome structure. And we were stupid enough to try and make a dome out of ceramics. It's a very bad idea. I strongly discourage you of doing that because ceramics are super fragile. But in theory, it works. Anyway, we built the first half of that pavilion in Brussels last summer, and we have to finish it next year in Saint-Étienne as a permanent structure. And here it was an attempt using a motif from traditional Islamic architecture, the muqarnas, which is a honeycomb structure, which so far has only been used as a decorative mold, experimenting with taking that decoration and making it into a new structural system. So I hope it holds, but yeah, it looks good.
Yes, I have a quick question. At the beginning of the presentation, you showed smaller scales of sacred ecologies or less visible sacred ecologies, like with the photo report from the Mecca and the small prayer room in Paris. So, like, what do you think is the place of these less visible, like, spatial rituals in the city, in opposition to, like, these monuments, in terms of the possibility for the regeneration of rituals in general?
I think it's about it's about the place that we want to allow them to hold in the city. So the examples that I showed, they stem out of necessity. They are appropriations of existing buildings by migrant populations. This has always happened, as you mentioned, in Lebanon. Obviously, also a mosque turns into a church, turns back into a mosque, and then who knows. But anyway, so the reuse of buildings and of places of worship has always happened. But to me, the question here is political. In Europe, in the global south, what does it mean for non-mainstream religious practices to be limited to hidden forms of practice? And so it's not about allowing for more appropriations of existing buildings. It's going to happen. It's happening in restaurants. It's happening in places you wouldn't suspect. I think in Paris there's like this hairdresser that also operates as a prayer room. So it is born out of necessity. It's a very sustainable form of spatial practice, mind you. But still, there is an issue when that's the only form that is being allowed for these forms of worship. So I don't think it's the same in Istanbul. Istanbul has many beautiful mosques. I'm not sure they need more. But a building and a monument establishes hierarchy in the city. It says this is important, this is not. So we need to be aware also of the need for positive monuments. And then we could go into, what a decolonial monument is. And there's a fantastic work by Françoise Vergès and Somboy Vrenon on, I forgot the name, but de l'espace public décolonial or something like that. Anyway, just Google it, you can find it. But it's also about the fact that we, in the global north, and I say we as post-colonial migrant bodies, go through monuments that are dedicated to the submission of our people and our failures and the victories of someone else. So we need more monuments to our victories.
And it's certainly not by accident that Switzerland forbid the construction of minarets in 2009, I believe. So yes, that would kind of corroborate everything you said about the need for this architecture, of course. I think we'll close with this. I want to thank Summer, Nathalie, Adam, and of course Meriem and Archizoom for having us and for all the questions, Azar for the comfortable setup. Thank you very much.